things around the pot, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. It's showtime. We're recording this episode of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast on the morning of November the 20th. Where the hell did the month go? Wow, look at that. We're, 4 weeks from Christmas, and yikes. But yeah, and lots to talk about this week on the podcast. So let's get to it around the table. And Tim Hudak is here. He is partner at Council Public Affairs, former leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, and Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario. Our two other partners in crime, John Wright, Keith Leslie, normally here around the table at this time, but they are on the road traveling, so we're just going to have to punch above our weight today, guys.
Doctor pay, man. Doctor pay.
By 100%, I think. Right? Yeah. Indeed. Before we came on, Tim, you and I were talking about how I so look forward to Thursdays because it is our day to sit around the table for On the Ledge, but it's also take out the garbage day. So it gets me out of the house.
Yep.
And
Good. I'm glad to hear that. How was take out the garbage day today?
Well,
Dave?
you know what? I was way ahead of the curve because last night I played hockey. And when I got home from hockey, I thought, I'm not going to jam up my Thursday. I took the garbage out last night before.
Wow.
I was so organized.
And no raccoon incidents?
No. We're all good. And I only bring that up for the reason that our recycling bin is a lot heavier today than it was 6 months ago. And the reason is because the beer stores in my neighborhood are closed. The beer store near our cottage is closed. So we have ended up collecting all these freaking bottles, and we were bringing them home from the lake or whatever it might be. Got no place to put them. The local grocery store that sells liquor and beer and wine, they don't take the wine or the bottles back yet. So they're ending up in the recycling bin. And I just want to put it to both of you. I know it's not top burning issue, but it's one of these, literally a curbside issue. This is all going to recycling. I'm not getting my 20 cents back on the bottles, by the way. And the other side of this is the small, retailers who are being told they have to take the bottles back. The beer store's not around anymore. Why the hell isn't the LCBO taking bottles back? That is not part of the conversation. They pump out 1 billion liters of alcohol beverage a year. So there's not a chance that there's going to be any proportion for the local grocers in terms of the amount of bottles that they take back in terms of the bottles they sell. Shouldn't we be saying to the liquor store, you need to take some of these bottles back, Kathleen Wynne?
So I really hate this because I think it's unnecessary. And I'm just going to say, Tim, I think if you and I had a chance to sit down and figure this out with the players, I think we would have done better. I'm just going to say that because I think there are solutions here. It needed good planning, and the planning just didn't happen, Dave. I really think that's the issue. The spread of liquor in the grocery stores was sped up, and the introduction of the corner stores really debilitated the beer store. I mean, that was predictable, but in all of that, there should have been a planning process. And the grocery stores were pretty clear from the beginning; they didn't have the capacity to do this. So, I mean, I know they said they would do it, but then very quickly it became obvious they were not going to. Either their feet had to be held to the fire, Dave, or the liquor store. Like there had to be a solution to this. But in the meantime, what's happening to you is happening all over the province. I just hate it. It's unnecessary. It's bad planning, and it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary grief, quite frankly. Tim's going to agree with me. I know he is.
I love the notion that Premier Wynne and I would cooperate to solve this issue.
We could have.
And I would focus on the supply side because I certainly contribute to that stream of empties. So I'll
Well,
focus on
I gotta
that.
say, it's embarrassing to see how many blue bags are full of bottles in the garage after we've collected them from all over the place.
Publicly showing off
Right.
what I've had
But
to
that's months and months, right, Dave?
Well, yeah, usually.
I do want to say you're putting some cash then into your blue bin then. So you may find some of the less desirable on the ledge listeners lining up in front of your house next Thursday morning to start loading up on all your empties, just as a bit of a warning. All right, so I'll switch to serious side on this issue. Yours is like one of those, hey, yeah, like why doesn't the LCBO take the bottles back? They're the major provider. They certainly have space, right? The reason why some of the smaller stores is off the hook is just because they don't really have the capacity. LCBO certainly would. I remember how I got scolded in the panel by Finance Minister Peter Bethenfall when he thought our numbers were off before on this issue. So maybe he's watching this one as well, and we'll hear from him for next week. But it certainly seems sensible. You want to have multi-point, right? I mean, the blue box is currently a mess. Costs are going through the roof. We're not really getting anywhere near the recycling that we should. And I think we're actually a laggard. And Premier Wynne will remember, but I think we're actually a laggard in collection compared to other provinces. When we first brought in Blue Box under legendary Jim Bradley, by the way, we were at the forefront. I would, there's some, I love my work at Council of Public Affairs. It's like the politics side where every day you've got 5-6 different clients you're working on. And, you're working with to advance. And there's some that I'm really excited if I could get a chance to work on. And I would love to work on this issue. I do find it compelling. Maybe Premier Wynne and I will work. We'll bring her in as one of our consultants on this issue. But I will tell you too, like when Deb and I have been, in the States, they also have private collection, right? Whether that's in grocery stores or private depots, where you could bring in your recyclables of all kinds, whether they're alcohol beverages or bottles of water, get the money back, and then you're incented then to shop in that store. I don't know if we have regulatory barriers, there's not enough capacity in the system, but surely to goodness, Dave Trafford, we could do a heck of a lot better than forcing you to put into the recycling system. It'll disappear into glass and actually clog up the system even more.
Well, and we kind of make light of the fact that, there's people out there who might be starting to troll my blue bin. But it wasn't long ago. We were taking a bunch of bottles. We were going to take them to the beer store to return them. And as we were putting them in the back of the car, there's a woman stops in front of our house. And she gets out of her car and she said, "Are you taking those to the beer store?" And I said, "Yeah. Do you mind if I took them?" And this was her state of life, that the 10 bottles or whatever it was amounted to nothing. It's pocket change for the most part. But it made a difference in her day to be able to take that money, and that's what she was doing. So and I wouldn't say that we live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of that going on. So I think it kind of speaks to the issue, back to the idea of putting money into the blue bin. But I still don't understand why this wasn't part of the initial conversation for the LCBO to take responsibility and accountability for the amount of bottles and vessels that they're pumping out every year.
Because there's an upfront cost, Dave. And I think, to my point about this all having moved very, very quickly, the expansion of the sales of alcohol moved more quickly than the system was ready to absorb. That doesn't excuse the LCBO. It doesn't excuse the grocery stores. It's just sort of, I think, the explanation of what has happened. And if I think back to when we were moving to put beer and wine in grocery stores, it was an arduous process. We had to work with the beer store to get that deal. We had to assure the liquor store that, there were protections in place for them. And one of the things we did then was make sure that we rolled out the number of grocery stores in a predictable way. And, it's just that kind of planning was not done in this last phase. And so we're in a mess now, and it's way harder to recreate a system than to have it evolve as you bring in the changes. And Tim has raised, the regulatory, if there are regulatory issues, those should have been dealt with in terms of whether it's private sector. So, most of us wouldn't care as long as there's a place where we can go and we know those empties are going to be are going to be dealt with and reused. And the blue box is not the answer. Tim is absolutely right. The blue box has got its own problems. We can't count on that. And to your point about the woman who picked up your empties, I mean, when Jane was and this is one of Jane's jobs, she takes the empties back to the beer store. There's usually someone or a box for them, people to pick them up. And I mean, that raises a whole other issue about homelessness and about affordability, and that's another conversation. But the fact is that there was a system in place. The system's now broken, and there hasn't been a strategy to put a new system in place. It's really unfortunate.
And I think there will be pressures, right? I mean, the government does have to address the blue box. And I think one of the reasons that Minister McCarthy was put in there is because he's the kind of guy that's attracted to complex problems and wants to solve them. So I think the Premier's right that the pressure will build up. And Dave, you're not going to be the only one doing that, because it is harder to find a beer store. I suspect part of this, and again, I do hope that the minister calls me and fills me in, but I suspect there's probably a bit of the legacy in terms of the transition out of beer. And initially they were given the exclusive right for the recycling. So there may be some attachment to why the government-run LCBO cannot do this. I think the Premier's right. It is a cost center for the government to do that. And the LCBO, increasingly seen as a way to generate revenue as opposed to economic growth for the wine regions and craft beer and such. And I think at the end of the day, though, the beer store is often an unpleasant place to go for many people. Deb, for example, does not like going to the beer store. Now is further away to boot on that. So you really do need to open more outlets. In the meantime, they could look at LCBO, Dave, but I really think that there are more people in the system who see it as a profit generator because they bring customers in. The better that is for consumers, for convenience, saves you time, better is for recycling results at the end of the day.
Yeah, I don't know what we do in our neighborhood without the Cubs and Scouts, because about 3 times a year they have a bottle drive, right? And they realize the value in that, and it's really easy to do. But the other side of this, as you're talking, Tim, I'm thinking, maybe we shouldn't pay the 20 cents on a bottle until we bring it back to the LCBO, right?
So you lost me there.
Well, I'm giving the money back to whomever is actually going to take my recycled bottle, my empty bottle, as opposed to paying it up front and then not ever getting my deposit back. At least I'm sending it back to somebody who can take care of the empties.
Yeah, I do like the incentive system, right? I'm incentivized by that, and maybe it's a bit of a game, right? And I'd like to figure out how many I've got here and how many in my plastic bag as I go back to the beer store. And that doesn't work for everybody.
It's the 10-year-old boy in you.
I think that's probably true, right? Stack up my boxes on big building blocks.
How many cards can you buy?
Knock it off the next case, all that stuff. But I do believe that people do respond to incentives. So I like the notion of deposit. In fact, in our lifetimes, we had that for other beverage containers, and I would collect up the pop bottles and go and buy a comic book and all that. So I think it's a way of building and expanding on incentives and having more places to bring things back that are convenient for consumers. I think that's the solution, and that will help relieve pressure on blue box as well.
I also think, Dave, it really demonstrates the beer store collection system really demonstrate exactly what Tim's saying, that people will do this if it's convenient. They will bring them back. I mean, we get glass milk bottles from a dairy up here near Alliston, and we take them back to the Zayre store because the Zayre store will collect them. And, it's not a lot of money, but there's something satisfying about being able to take that bottle back and know it's going to be reused. I think people will do it, but it's got to be easy.
Yeah, well, we used to take the milk bottles, the jugs back to Becker's in the day, so because there was a deposit on it, right? So it's funny how we've grown away from that kind of culture around the bottles and the reusables. So anyway, we leave it out there. If the minister wants to offer notes on this segment of the program, we're happy to take them. Okay, so last 3 weeks, all we've talked about is the Skills Development Fund, and it hit a crescendo again this week, courtesy of the Leader of the Opposition, Marit Stiles.
Bills are being rammed through this legislature. It is the donors and the lobbyists that are connected to this government. It is the strip clubs and the numbered companies. It is the endless grift of a anti-democratic and, yes, corrupt government.
I will ask to withdraw. I will ask the member to withdraw.
Speaker, I will not.
I am warning the member. The member has been named. You will have to leave the chamber.
And with that, the opposition leader, Marit Stiles, was escorted out of the legislature. And I know, Tim, I heard you on the radio this morning talking about this, and it's rather strategic, it's tactical, it's performative, whatever it is you want to say. But how effective is that?
Oh, it's effective. We're talking about it. And, as we're recording Thursday morning, Skills Development Fund and the Education Bill were back on the agenda because of Marit Stiles. Now, that's, clouded a bit because we'll talk about what happened in the legislature, but she did successfully get it back on the page. I'm happy to tell some stories about, my time as PC leader and some of the tactics and some of the stories, Dave, if you like. But on the serious part of the question, so you will use this tactic if you feel that maybe a story is losing momentum. You may use this tactic if you feel the media is not covering it enough, and you call attention to it, particularly if it's the leader that gets tossed out. And I did get tossed out. And we also planned and had caucus members tossed out on occasion. So this tells me two things. Number one, there were two protests that day. I was at the legislature at Queen's Park, in fact, myself that day, a large education protest. So you want to make sure you connect with that crowd. They would very much be potential New Democrat voters. So she wants to sort of evoke the emotion that they're feeling about the bill, through question period. I think secondly, most importantly, trying to keep momentum on the Skills Development Fund and trying to land some body blows to the Ford government on insiders benefiting. And we talked about this last week extensively, and the political calculation, do you try to get through the session and you don't show blood to the opposition, or do you decide, okay, we're going to make some changes in the fund and the allocations and kill the issue? And one tactic we didn't talk about, which I think happened this week, is the Ford government brought forward a number of bills that were very attractive for media coverage, one of which, or at least concepts, if not bills, one of which was making the sex offender registry public for high-risk offenders so parents could know to take precautions. It got a lot of coverage. Had the idea that I campaigned on as well. I do like it. And another one with respect to people who would kill somebody in an auto accident being responsible for paying child payments. And the third one, which is highly impactful, but it was still news, is around Made in Ontario policies for all government procurement. At any rate, my point being here, the Ford government did change the channel in some of the coverage away from being on their heels on the Skills Development Fund. I think this was largely about Marit Stiles trying to get back that issue on the front page.
Well, we'll get to why and how you were kicked out presently, but I'm curious
Sure.
to get Kathleen Wynne's take on that performance.
Yeah, I think that I largely agree with Tim. Marit and John Fraser, to be fair, have been hammering on the Skills Development Fund. The legislature is coming to the end of its session, and so I think that to break through some of the distracting noise of the other legislation that Tim has just gone through, that the government has brought forward, she was clear that she wanted to talk to the media. I mean, the thing about being named and escorted out of the legislature is that you go out and immediately there'll be a scrum in the hall, and that's kind of the point, is to go out and to be able to talk to the media before all the other members are out, before the premier's there, and the ministers. So I think that it's very hard to get through as the opposition. It's hard to get through the media noise that is generated by a majority government, and I think this is one of the things that you can do, and I think it was kind of effective what she did.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing for me though, Tim, and you cited the other headlines that kind of cut through and made sort of talk radio gold to some degree in terms of the legislation that was introduced or discussed or considered. But the overarching headline around skills development, it wasn't just one story this week. There were about 3 different angles on this story. The Toronto Star getting a hold of documents that showed that low-scoring applicants averaged the highest payouts in skills development. Global News reporting, the Labor Minister blaming civil servants because after an organization that got some funding had been audited, et cetera, and continued to get funding. CTV News Ford is defending the system of skills development funding, won't axe the minister. And then the Trillium, which has been doing, yeoman's work on this, talked about it. What was really interesting is that they did some polling. They found that the Ford government is more popular now than it was during the election earlier this year. So its numbers, that should be a positive. But on the downside, like 6 in 10 Ontarians are concerned about the way skills development is being handled. So this is really sinking in terms of general perception of how the government is conducting its business. Yeah.
And did you want to come back to some stories or on the?
Well, I'd be just curious to see, in terms of the slow drip, the flood, whatever. This is continuing, and then we'll come back to your tactics of getting kicked out.
All right, because it was fun. And I miss that place. I do. Not going back, but days like that, I miss that place. So I think the Ford government, you're right, there were continuing stories, but if you look back at our podcast last week, we all thought the temperature would be going up even hotter. And I think it actually cooled a little bit. I've talked about some of the other issues that the Ford government put out, which got a lot of media attention and detracted from being on defense. Secondly, you did see Minister Piccini punch back more on this. He made a case that civil servants aren't always right, or they'll bring up criteria that don't actually fit with the governments. Like one was about the civil service saying in a particular grant would get negative media attention because it was, some media outlets and not others. And he said that's actually a political call, not the bureaucrats' call on the communication side. So, yeah, they're still on defense, but they didn't seem to have as many pucks going in the net as previous weeks. And my gut tells me that's a reflection of why Marit Stiles, use that tactic, which you can only use every once in a while. Otherwise, it has no use and you don't look like a leader, right? I think she did it well, executed well, made the right call. But it shows me that my gut is right, that the momentum on this issue politically was slowed down.
And Dave, can I just say,
yeah.
The only thing that confused me about her, or bemused me probably about her strategy is that, as Tim says, there was a very large education protest yesterday in front of the legislature, and Marit Stiles is a former school trustee. She knows exactly how dangerous Bill 33 is to the local democratic process, and yet she went on this rather than that. And I think it's clear that the skills development, 6 in 10 Ontarians do not know about or care about the education bill. 6 in 10 Ontarians care about the skills development fund. So I think there's, it's pretty clear where the heat is in terms of pressure on this government. But I suspect that when she went out and talked in that scrum, she also talked about the education bill because there was an audience for that. But I think it's amazing, actually, that 6 in 10 Ontarians know enough about the issue to even have an opinion about it. So it just speaks to how it's kind of broken through to people's consciousness.
Well, they drill down even further, and 4 in 10 PC voters were concerned about it. So, the core is starting to, say, what the hell at this point. But Tim, I think the Premier's right on this, that Marit Stiles is looking at the numbers. I suspect that your attitude about school boards and education is probably more in line with the majority of the people who consume this podcast, as opposed to the people who are concerned about skills development. So she's going to ring the bell that's going to ring loudest.
Misguided as that position is.
Perhaps, yes. So we've heard, yes.
There seems to be a bit of back and forth over a decade plus on this issue between the Premier and I. Although the tug of war is going in my direction a little bit at a time, I think. So look, I think that the New Democrats and the Liberals, right, have, if you will put this in a game framing, have scored a lot of points on the skills development fund. And I think actually, aside from the height of the Greenbelt, which I think, was not a lasting impact on the Ford voter universe, they've had the most success in pointing out weaknesses in the government. So it's going to be very tempting to stick with that. And look, it's a $1.5 billion fund. It's been around a long time. There's a considerable number of groups that have benefited from that. And so it does provide a lot of fodder when you do that join the dots strategy to say, hey, this is connected to party donations and what have you. And they're not going to give up on that. Well, we got 2 more weeks left in this session, or 3 more weeks. They will continue on that issue. But I think for the time being, the government's response strategy, tactics probably more than strategy, did take some of the heat off.
It is, well, it is interesting. It still is interesting to me that the minister hasn't been moved. It's, I think the fact that he's now turning to throw bureaucrats under the bus. Maybe that is going to be a winning strategy, but that kind of deflection often doesn't fly, because it'll come back to the minister's desk. So, I guess they're just going to ride it out, but it is interesting to me that they didn't take action. And now I think it's gone so far, and the premier has dug his heels in terms of supporting the minister. I think it gets harder and harder for him to do a pivot on that.
All right, Tim, let us know. You got kicked out. You plan to be kicked out. Now, were you ever kicked out as a member rather than just as the leader? And it was strategically made sense for you to be the guy to take the hit that day?
Yeah, and I think the most interesting question was Kathleen Wynne ever kicked out of the legislature? So I'll use that for my supplemental.
Yeah.
I got kicked out. That was a badge of honor. And I got kicked out as leader. I got kicked out as an opposition member. Never on the government side. That's not a tactic really that happens. And it was clearly really one of 3 categories when this would happen. One, an issue that you want to focus on is not getting the traction attention from the media, so you really got to turn the volume up to 11. Secondly, you're worried about an issue that's good for you in opposition is petering out, so you try to light the flame under it again. Or third, there'll be issues that you're hearing from constituents, your voter bloc, that aren't being addressed, and you have to show them that you care, that you're on side. So there's usually those 3. And then we would talk about it in caucus and decide, who should be kicked out under what circumstances in the approach. Having the leader being kicked out is the A-bomb. Having other caucus members like the Bulldogs within caucus is, more common tactic. And I remember as leader asking folks who would like to, get kicked out in various strategy. And Premier Wynne may have seen the same amount of people in her caucus, right? You've got those people who are, always in the principal's office, who would raise their hand. I want to get kicked out. I want to get kicked out. But, Randy Hillier or Bill Murdoch being kicked out wasn't really news, right? That could happen in any given.
It's just another day that ends in Y.
It was surprising they let Bill Murdoch in, period.
For sure. And then you'd have your really good kids in class, like the Ted Arnott, Elizabeth Whitmer, Julia Monroe, right? Very honorable members, always played very straight. They'd be horrified if my eyes cast their way to ask them to skip. They would be a dead no. But I was kicked out both as leader. I think that was around taxation issues. And I remember also being kicked out because I was a pretty good bulldog as a member of caucus. I was one of those volunteers, I guess. And I wore a T-shirt underneath my dress shirt into the legislature. And it was a picture of Dalton McGuinty with a Pinocchio nose because we were driving the broken promises issue. And the speaker at the time, Crozier, was furious that I had done this. And then I kept going and pushing until he kicked me out. And then I actually got pretty carried away because he goes behind the speaker's chair and was still yelling at me as I was standing in the house and called me out and stuff like that. That got a little hot. We all stepped away. My last story, and I'm going along, this is a bit crass, but the one thing I never had to do, I remember being approached by John Baird, who was our House leader at the time. We wanted a delay tactic against a Liberal bill and had to just talk for, up to 12, 14 hours, something like that. And in the meeting, he also brought a diaper to me. And he says, you should really consider to pull off this tactic. This might be advisable. So to finish the story, luckily, a resolution was arrived. I didn't have to use that diaper on my desk, choose yes or no, and take my chances. I dodged that one. But sometimes that's as far as the opposition will go to drive a point.
All right. Well,
isn't that nice?
Did you win, though? Did you win the day?
Yeah, there was an agreement between the Liberals and the Conservatives on how to approach a bill and hearings and stuff like that. So the Depends stayed in the box.
There you go.
Happily.
Yes.
All right. Now have you been kicked out, Kathleen Wynne?
So, to Tim's point about whether you're in opposition or in government, I was elected in 2003. We were in government until 2018. So I was not kicked out. And then when I was in opposition in the third, well, we weren't even a party with the 7 seats from 18 to 22. we really weren't in any position to be having that kind of tactic. So no, I was never kicked out as a member. However, before before I was elected, there were a number of years under the Harris government when Tim was in government, that I was in the legislature a lot, whether it was, during the filibuster on Bill 107, the amalgamation bill, or Bill 104, the education school board amalgamation bill. I was there a lot, and I was in the gallery, and I was very worked up. I was an activist. We were there with groups. John Sewell and I were part of Citizens for Local Democracy. And anyway, I was there. I got removed from the gallery a number of times. And the funny part of that story is when I was elected in 2003 and I came back into the legislature and we were going through the process of getting our ID and so on, and meeting the security folks, some of the security guys came up to me and said, "Oh, well, we know you. You've been around here for years." I said, "Yeah, you were kicking me out of the legislature. Now I'm perfectly legitimate. You have to let me in." So yeah, so that was how I started. So that probably fed into why I was interested in showing my more decorous the side of my personality while I was in office.
Now, what kind of response do you get from the security team at the door when you go back to Queen's Park, Kathleen?
Me?
Yeah.
Very positive.
Okay, good.
I've outlived that part of my career. No, actually, it's interesting, and this is kind of inside baseball, but Tim will know this. The former members are now being given cards so that, because now there's like airport security when you go into the legislature.
Yeah.
And so we're actually being given a pass that allows us to expedite that process. So yeah, we're treated very well, with a lot of respect when we go back in, which is lovely.
It's really nice, and we're blessed, right? The security are highly professional, keep the place safe, whether members, staff, and guests. But yeah, they do treat us very, very well as former members. And there's a tradition, Dave, that not everyone may be aware of, but even as a former member, you could enter the building at any time. Christmas, New Year's Eve, they give you that respect for your service. And anyway, as I said, I missed that place. It was fun to be back yesterday. And I think Kramer and I both really appreciate the incredible staff that are there to support the Ontario legislature and how well they treat us.
Absolutely. It is, it sounds kind of trite, but it's absolutely true. Every single day I walked into that building, it felt like a pinch me moment. This is such a privilege. And that literally I was there for 19 years. And I can honestly say that I felt that every time. And when I go back, I have that same feeling, and actually it's quite emotional. I mean, there is nothing like being part of that democratic process. Anyway.
Well, and I would say, just as being the paid observer who wandered the halls, there's a certain vibe in that building that you don't get. Maybe you did from the House of Commons in Parliament in Ottawa, but there's a different vibe at Queen's Park. That you're right. There's a certain energy around it. There isn't a level of, I wouldn't say it's stuffiness, but I think there's a certain level of, there's a sense of history as soon as you walk in the building, right? Mm-hmm. And then, holy cow, who else wandered these halls? It's just kind of a cool place.
And yet it's small enough, and the number of people is small enough that you actually can get to know people, Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that's true at the House of Commons as well, but it's just a bigger operation. And I think Queen's Park, when I started going there as that rowdy activist, people could go in until the Harris government started putting up barricades. But you could just go into the legislature, and it really felt like the people's house. And it still feels like that.
Before we go, I want to get into a few things that popped up this week, particularly a couple of things you've already mentioned, Tim, and that would be the introduction of legislation that would make some parts of the sex offender registry, the sex traffic registry, publicly accessible. And I think it was misrepresented in some corners this week in terms of we're just going to open the whole thing up and we're going to look at everything that's on this and make it all public. I think that there probably is a grounds for this, and incrementally to be able to say, this is accessible. But, at what point do we create even guidelines or guardrails around how accessible some of this is from your perspective?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was happy to see this. I hope the federal government goes through with it. I think it resonates with not all, but a significant number of Ontarians. And look, it was a bit personal too, because when Deb and I were in our neighborhood in North Toronto, shortly after we had moved in, we heard from neighbors, thankfully, that there's somebody down the street who had been convicted of sex offenses against both boys and girls, and had masqueraded as a piano teacher. So thankfully neighbors told us about that. Maitland ended up going into piano. It was an important precaution, I think, and you would hear that word of mouth from neighbors, but that's not going to be accurate all of the time.
Right.
And when I was PC leader and campaigned on this, I'm sure it needs to be updated. But there were a significant number of states, and I thought some provinces that allowed this as well. But you make a good point, Dave. There's different levels of threat. There's different reasons why I made up the list and have to check in with police from time to time. But surely we can find that line for the most, risky sex offenders who, are out in the street, in the neighborhood, on parole, what have you. I do think that their privacy is trumped by the safety of kids and families in that neighborhood. And smart people can find that line. Yeah,
and what worries me, that sort of the both sides of this edge, then, Kathleen, is that on the one hand, the local neighborhood kind of is plugged into this, and we know the guy over there is, he's a problem. But then it becomes, I hesitate to use the word gossip, but it's just not necessarily as accurate as we might otherwise want. So we want some officialdom involved there. But at the same time, where do you draw that line? Because I think there is a public interest in a public security issue here.
Yeah. These questions are bedeviling, quite frankly, because people who have served time and have paid their debt to society ostensibly, but may still have problematic issues in their lives. I think we need to figure out how to balance those protections for the individual and for the community without going into disclosure that could lead to vigilantism. Gossip's one thing, but we have to just be really clear that putting people further at risk who are troubled, that's not okay either. So I think that this has to be very, very carefully drafted. And there has to be some sort of official frame around it if we're going to go down this road. But it's not simple. And my problem with the way the Premier talks about these things is he makes them sound simple. He makes them sound kind of folksy, and I just, all these guys, we just gotta deal with them like it is an easy thing to do. It is not easy. It is very complicated, and people have to understand that. So I hope there's a good consultation period. I hope, the police and social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists are brought in and they have good input into this, and that there is a use of evidence. And one of the things I worry about with this government, Dave, is that often bills are brought in that do not have enough of a basis in evidence. And so I want to know what the evidence is that they are using to base this legislation on. So that means it's going to take time. If we see something come forward very, very quickly, then I think we have a right to be very wary that it's not going to have the guardrails in it that it needs to.
Yeah, as this whole thing unfolds, I hearken back to the days when I was covering the Maple Leaf Gardens sex abuse story back in the late 90s. And when Gordon Stuckless was being released from prison and was going to be incorporated into a halfway house in Toronto, we knew exactly where it was, and there was a huge media scrum around the place waiting for his arrival, and all it did, Tim, was drive him underground. So there's that part of it that we have to kind of keep in mind, making and I guess some people in that neighborhood would have said, great, he's not going to come to the neighborhood. Yeah, that's terrific, but went somewhere else.
Yeah, no, I remember thinking through all these issues and trying to find the right balance when I said we should do this in the province. And look, I have a lot of faith that this is the right thing to do, and it can be worked out. And yeah, sometimes, as premier, you speak in poetry, and then you leave it to the ministers to figure out the prose. Michael Kersner would be the lead on the Solicitor General, but Doug Downey, as Attorney General, I think would have a lot to say. And I've known Attorney General for a long time, well before he ran for office. He just strikes me as a smart, level-headed, principled guy. So, Dave, I hope they do this, and I am confident that kind of combination will land in the right place.
Yeah, and I think the other part of this is, it's come up, are we providing, do we create a solution in search of a problem? I mean, again, there's the other side. How much of a problem is this in local communities? And again, we don't know what we don't know. That's the problem.
In Welland.
I hear you. Yeah,
it just happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's what I mean about the evidence, Dave.
Yeah.
How do we quantify the problem, and then how do we design the solution to actually fit the problem? And I really agree with Tim. It's not that this isn't an issue. It is an issue. But I remember when John Tory at one point talked about convicted criminals should not be allowed to, I think this was his frame, convicted criminals should not be allowed to live in community housing, Toronto community housing. And I remember thinking at the time, on the face of it, that sounds like a very kind of reasonable thing. Somebody's convicted, they've done their time, but they're not allowed back in because they may commit another crime. But then the question is, well, where do we expect people to live? Sometimes these simplistic solutions lead to a ridiculous societal problem. So I think this is a problem like that. You have to say, okay, well, what's the impact going to be? So it just needs to be carefully done. That's all that I would ask.
The other note that popped up this week, again, Tim, you alluded to it earlier, is the idea that, anybody who is impaired behind the wheel ends up killing a parent should be liable for the support of the children who are orphaned. And again, sounds like, you're on the side of the angels on that one. But on the other hand, the challenge of making sure that this is at all enforceable or at all effective, that does this drive up insurance prices? Does it start to talk about other families who are going to end up paying for this because, I'm the guy who hit somebody, but my family's going to pay for it because now have this huge burden. So all of that is involved. Again, top line sounds good, but boy, once you start to creep down a little further, this is way more complicated.
For sure. And I don't know if this expression fully fits, but there's never anything new under the sun. And both Premier and I have had a lot of experience over the years and issues that have come and gone, or ones that we believed in that we still want to see happen. This is one I never really thought about before. It sort of caught me off guard. And, the expression that came to mind is I would support this on first reading. That's tradition. It gets in front of the legislature. I would support it on second reading. I'd actually like to explore this and see it, carefully thought through. I'm certainly sympathetic, right? When you see somebody who loses their parents and is orphaned as a result of a drunk driver, especially one that is a multiple time loser, that there should be some kind of liability. I don't know much about the civil courts, how effective they are, how long that takes, the cost of going into it. But I think it is actually a serious issue. I'm pleased the Attorney General will bring it forward. My gut is I'd like to see some way of trying to make this work. But having no background in it in the past, I look forward to that final debate.
Yeah, well, the litigator in my family, Kathleen, says that, the challenge is not even when somebody dies, it's when they're, very badly injured, and those costs are significant. So does that begin to weigh into this situation, so that if I'm disabled to a point where I can't support my family, is the driver of the other vehicle on the hook for that?
So this is another example of something that sounds on the face of it, I think, very kind of intuitive. And I talked about this with a mom of little kids yesterday in her 40s, and I sort of said, this is what the government's suggesting, and her immediate response was, well, that's a good idea. And then we talked about, well, what about parents who are killed in other ways? I mean, are we saying that when a parent is killed, or parents are killed, whether they're stabbed, shot, whatever it is, in whatever way, and someone is held responsible, does that mean that they are then responsible for child support? I think that is an inevitable question that will be raised. And, in the kind of chatter about this over the last couple of days, there's been a lot of conversation about the Family Responsibility Office and how hard it is to get people to pay child support anyway. So the enforceability of this becomes a question as well. But again, I think it on the face of it, it sounds like something that could be explored. I think it's way more complicated than it sounds, and ultimately would be very difficult to implement.
Yeah, I think that the heart of the problem is that we lose sight of the issue, the real problem, and that is drunk driving.
Yeah.
Very quickly. And again, not to suggest that by any means that by promoting this, we're supporting, DUI, but it just becomes, that's the loss. Contact and the context of it. What do we do to make sure that people don't drink and drive? This doesn't necessarily stop that.
Well, and I also think that there was a kind of narrative in the last couple of days that this was actually connected to that one case, Mutso in Vaughan, right? And I'm not sure writing a law that is targeted at one family actually makes sense. Again, where's the evidence that would demonstrate that this is something that would work and wouldn't open up a whole can of worms in terms of other liabilities? I just don't know the answer to that. And if Tim and I were back at Queen's Park, we'd be able to have that conversation.
Solve that one too.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. So before we go, there was a couple of headlines that weren't necessarily about Ontario politics or policy, but I thought, it sure rings an interesting bell. And a couple of weeks ago, we saw the headline that, Quebec doctors are applying to work here in Ontario in significant numbers. I think the story suggested that the College of Physicians and Surgeons here in Ontario had 19 applications for Quebec doctors to come to Ontario between June and October or something. Recently, since then, it's been hundreds who have applied. And because of the bill, was it Bill 2 in Quebec? And under that idea that the doctors are being paid based on outcomes, to put it mildly, but it's basically performance-based. On the other hand, we've got Alberta this week planning to allow doctors to deliver public and private services at the same time. And, the hue and cry immediately is that, well, that doesn't help the problem because there's a limited number of doctors. So it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to get healthcare delivered any more efficiently or effectively. But Tim, this is a place where I think the provinces are trying to use your vernacular, repair the old jalopy to actually get it back on the road.
Yeah, it's true, right? It is. We got a huge audience, obviously, on the ledge. This is one of our topics of debate just last week, I think, right? And I played the old Generation X versus the baby boomer card, and I thought you folks would change the system by now, and maybe in Alberta. Look, I always struck me as odd and unsustainable that Canada were the only country, without a parallel private system and some sort of choice in the system, whether that's UK, whether that's Sweden, whether that's Korea, Japan. And I'm not talking the American system. I'm talking about broadly, with the exception maybe of North Korea and Cuba. And the way they do that, it does two things. Funding that will go, patients that go into the private system then our professionals there usually will pay back in the public system to help expand. Usually a bit of a quid pro quo. Jeez, I need more of my coffee. And secondly, it also takes pressure out of the system. If somebody wants to get something done more quickly, that opens up spots for those in the public system. So I've always argued this is inevitable. I think it's actually healthy for Canada. I think it brings in more funding, more innovation, and relieves the long lines that some people have to suffer in our healthcare system. And good for Premier Smith in putting this on the table.
Yeah, I talked to Danielle Martin, doctor at I think she's at Women's College.
Women's College, yeah.
And she's so eloquent on this, and she was the one who went to the United States, went to Washington to school the Congress on the merits of the Canadian system, and she will first admit it's not perfect. But at the same time, she also points out that there's an incredible amount of private money already in our public healthcare system, just based on the benefits that a lot of people have at work. That insurance is private money. That gets you, benefits that go beyond what OHIP gets you. So I think, Kathleen, we can't have this conversation and immediately stop and say private is bad. We just can't do that.
No. And I think, to Danielle's point, and actually it's interesting, I use her book Better Now, it's called, in my public policy course that I teach, and it always engenders a great conversation among the students about the private versus public. And the kids in the class are from different countries. They come from all over the world, so they have a different experience. So we already have services that are delivered privately that aren't covered by Medicare. We already have services that are delivered privately but paid for publicly. So the Kensington Eye Clinic, actually, that under our government was put in place, was a different model. I think that we have to be careful when we look at what's happening in Alberta and Quebec. In both situations, the premiers, I think, are trying to create a better system of primary care. That's what they're trying to deal with, right? Is making sure that everybody has a primary care physician or a nurse practitioner, because they are the navigators in the system. And so I don't think that what Danielle Smith is going to solve that problem in a good way myself. I think that, you'll see talent siphoned off, although she is, it sounds like, requiring that doctors work in both systems. So I think that that makes some sense. What's happening in Quebec, I think, is more problematic, obviously, which is why you're seeing doctors leaving. The fines that are being put in place if people don't comply with the legislation, is a real disincentive. But look, I really think that we have a problem across the country with primary care. The Ford government brought in Jane Philpott to try to resolve that issue, and she was working actually on a plan that our government had put in place in terms of interdisciplinary care, and that's part of the solution. That's one of the big ideas that Danielle Martin puts forward. So I would just say we already have private money in the system. We already have private delivery. Let's do everything we can to make sure that we keep the system publicly funded, and let's solve the problem that actually exists. If it's not about throwing more money into a bad system, which I kind of agree with in some ways, and it's actually about the delivery of the service and the access that people have to a primary physician. I will just say quickly, and this makes me really old, Tim, the baby boomer for sure, and even going back to the great generation. My grandfather and my father were docs. They both worked in teams. My dad was in a practice of 4. Anybody who was in their practice, those 4 docs, could get a doctor any time of day. And I know that because I lived in a house where the phone would ring in the middle of the night and my dad was on call and he had to go. We don't have that anymore. And I'm not hearkening back to the good old days, but I am saying that when someone needs a doctor in the middle of the night, they need a doctor in the middle of the night. And what we're saying now is go to the emergency room or talk to somebody on a phone. And that's not going to cut it for most people. And so this was a big argument we had with the Ontario Medical Association, trying to figure out how to remunerate family docs well enough so that they would be providing in the family health teams or those interdisciplinary models the service that people need. Let's solve that problem before we start talking about a private system.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and Tim, you brought up the U.S. model, and that's front and center right now because of what's going on legislatively south of the border. But I heard a really interesting statistic for everyone who wants to say, well, the Americans get it better and they get it faster and they get it all right. the average American per person pays $13,000 a year for medical services, and they have an 80% disapproval rating. So in what other world would we spend that kind of money and be 80% against the service that we're getting? So just for context, I think we always look to the States as the example, but you're right. Look to Britain and France and South Korea and all the other places around the world that are managing to do it, for sure.
The Western European countries, right?
Yep.
I mean, we look as a reference. We look to the States as a reference point. I think oftentimes to how not to do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
We need to be looking farther afield in terms of how should we be doing it.
No doubt. I think the salient reason why we don't have more choice in our healthcare system today is because of the American comparison, the faults in their system. And part of the identity is to talk about how we're different from the Americans. If our neighbor instead were Netherlands, were Japan, or France, we wouldn't even be talking about this issue today. Yeah, we need a broader peripheral vision on this for sure. Listen, thanks for this, Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, and we're hopeful that Keith Leslie and John Wright had safe travels today, and we'll all be back around the table next week. So this has been good. Couple of things, just notes before we go, and reminders that we will be on whatever app you listen to this podcast on. You can find us there. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button, and away we go. That'll be excellent. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube if you're watching. Also hit the subscribe button. That would be fun. If you've got a question or a comment, you can go to my website, davetrafford.com. There's an On the Ledge page there, and you can hit the button, just ask a question, make a comment. You'll see that it pops up there. You can see that orange button right there. It says start recording, and that will allow you to be involved in the show. And if it's, it's a comment, good, bad, or otherwise, maybe Minister Bethlen Falvey wants to use that mode to make comments and notes about the show this week. All right, that'll do it for us. It is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. Enjoy your weekend.